Hey, hello everyone, and welcome you all on the Learn and Grow the World Best Loving platform. As you already know that hey, you got latest tech updates and tech news. So today the main important update is the best part of Windows 11 is a revamped Windows subsystem for Linux. So I am going to tell you the two main points in this video. Okay, the first point is what is the best part, as I already told, and second thing is what is bug in Windows 11. You should know. If you don't know, then you very carefully you have to listen. But before I am going to tell you about bug, I am going to give you the details of best part. Okay, so let's start, and don't skip this video. Listen very carefully for today update. In our main Windows 11 review posted earlier this week, we covered the majority of new features and designs decisions in Microsoft's newest consumer operating system, and it feels reasonable to characterize the overall impression given there as lukewarm. The good news is that we still had not covered the best part of Windows 11 Linux. Okay, for years now, Windows 10 Windows subsystem for Linux has been making life easier for developers, admins, and hobbyists who have one foot in the Windows world and one foot in the Linux world. But WSL Handy, as it is, has been hobbled by several things it could not do. Installing WSL has never been as easy as it should be, and getting graphical apps to work has historically been possible, but also a pain in the butt that required some fairly obscure third-party software. Windows 11 finally fixes both of those problems. The Windows subsystem for Linux is not perfect on Windows 11, but it's huge improvement over what came before. Installing WSL on Windows 11. So what about this? Let's start to listen. Microsoft has traditionally made installing WSL more of a hassle than it should be, but the company finally got the process right in Windows 10 build 2004. Just open an elevated command prompt, start dash type. Okay, this will I will show you an image. Okay, reading somehow hard. Okay, you can understand. Type WSL install at the prompt and you are good to go. Windows 11 thankfully carries this process forward unchanged. A simple WSL install with no further arguments get you hype per fifth and the other underpinnings of WSL along with the current version of Ubuntu. If you are not an Ubuntu fan, you can see what other easily installable distributions are available with the command WSL list online. If you decide you would prefer a different distro, you can install it instead with, for example, WSL install the OpenSUSE 4.2. If you are not sure which distribution you prefer, don't fret. You can install as many as you like simply by repeating WSL list online to enumerate your options and WSL install distro name to install whichever you like. Okay, installing a second distribution does not uninstall the first. It creates a separate environment independent of any others. You can run as many of these installed environments as you like simultaneously, okay, without fear of one messing up others. So the next topic is WSL now supports graphics and sounds. So what about this? Let's start. In addition to easy installation, WSL on Windows 11 brings support for both graphics and audio in WSL apps. This is not exactly a first. Microsoft debuted WSL-G in April with Windows 11 Insider Build 21364, but Windows 11 is the first production Windows build with WSL-G support. If this is your first time hearing of WSL-G, the short version is simple. You can install GUI app, for example Firefox, from your Ubuntu or other distro command line, and they will work as expected, including sound. When I installed WSL-G on Windows 11 on the framework laptop running Firefox from the Ubuntu terminal popped up the iconic browser automatically. Heading to YouTube in the it worked perfectly to with neither frame drops in the video nor glitches in the audio. Okay, if you are looking for how WSLG works, we can get you started there. Also, Microsoft decided to go future forward and build using the VLAN protocol rather than the increasingly elderly X11 Xrong to make it all work. It's meant building the graphical interface on the Western reference compositor for VLAN hitched to XVLAN to support 10th clients with free RDP providing connectivity between the native Windows system and the XVLAN apps running under WSLG. If you want to dig further into the early details of WSLG architecture, we highly recommend our Microsoft on April 19 dev blog post on exactly that topic. So the next topic is what can I do with WSLG on Windows 11. So one of the most repeated question we have seen about WSLG can be expressed as why bother. This is because the majority of GUI killer apps in the Linux world are not really Linux specific. The vast majority have already been ported directly to the Windows platform, and for those apps running the native Windows ports frequently makes more senses. Okay, with that said, there is one obvious killer app for WSLG that has us excited, and it's Word Manager, the Red Hat okay originated virtualizations management tools. Word Manager is a simple tool that streamlines the creation, management, and operation of virtual machines using the Linux kernel virtual machine. With Word Manager, you can see a simple list of your VMs along with how much disk, network, and CPU activity is currently associated with each. You can also manipulate their virtual hardware, example by adding or removing RAM, disks, network interfaces, and more. Start, pause, and stop them. Creation and destruction of VMS is easy and management. And finally, Word Manager allows you to pull a graphical console directly into each VM, which behaves just a physical display connected to a bare metal machine would. Okay, if all of this only worked on the local host, it would be pretty useless under WSLG. Nested virtualization in a thing, but it's generally not something you want to do in production. However, Word Manager allows you to manage the VMS on any machine you can SSH to, not just the local host. In practice, I use this remote management feature to manage many tens of hosts and few thousand VMS, both local and remote, on a day-to-day basis. But unfortunately, Word Manager never got a Windows port and seems unlikely to, but it runs under WSLG like a champ. In a screenshot above, you can see my framework laptop running Word Manager under WSLG connected via SSH to my Ubuntu workstation. The Ubuntu workstation has a variety of VMS installed and running, and Word Manager on my framework laptop can manage them all, including the Hackintosh VM and Windows Server 2012 R2 VM. It has console Windows Open 2. The cherry on top of his virtualization cake is just how well those console windows work. I had no trouble getting flawless YouTube playback on my Hackintosh VM console, complete with working glitch-free video audio. Okay, ironically, this is better remote control experience than I can manage with my real MacBook Air, which is unbearable to use for so much as spreadsheet work, thanks to it being limited to VNC over Wi-Fi. So what can't I do with WSLG on Windows 11? As much as we are loving the enhanced Windows subsystem for Linux functionality, in Windows 11 it's still not quite a real Linux VM. As far as I can tell, there is still no networking bridge mode, which means it's difficult to run a network server application like Apache, okay, Nginx, MySQL, Samba, etc. on your WSLG guest and expose its services to other machines on the network. This self-described, hilariously unsupported, unproved, and experimental workaround still seems to be the closest thing to a real network bridge available, which sharply limits the usability of WSL based application servers. You can't run GNOMES software center app under WSLG more accurately. You can install and run it, but it's effectively useless. We are not sure exactly what goes wrong with software center, but it pops up failed to connect to up power, okay, error on the console, and fails to list any available application. It also does not list all of our installed applications. This is a shame, as it otherwise would have been a nice way for Windows using Linux newbies to browse the software available for their new WSLG distribution. Okay, so you are also feeling somehow boring. Okay, this was very long update and I had to give you, so I also want to give you full to full update, so let's listen. It's somehow left. Okay, you also can't run the GNOME cell desktop environment itself under WSLG. Running apt install Gone cell work fine and pulls in the enormous list of dependencies necessary to satisfy that request, but GNOME shell itself falls ignominiously with unsupported session type, which effectively means it does not like WSLG Western X VLAN environment. Okay, so ZFS, listen very carefully. Finally, Ubuntu's excellent baked-in OpenZFS support is missing. You can apt install ZFS Utils Linux without difficulty, but that package depends on Canonical's in-house kernel with built-in ZFS support, which Microsoft has not picked up in its own WSL2 kernel. Determined Ubuntu users can still apt install ZFS Fuse and expect that user mode implementation to work as well as it does not under native Ubuntu, but we don't recommend it for production. The Fuse implementation is still stuck on 0.7.0 while the in-kernel version is 0.8.3. This means in lack of support of ZFS native encryption along with a whole host of other features, bug fixes and enhancements, let alone the performance implications of running under Fuse rather than in kernel. We did not test DKMS based implementations of in kernel ZFS such as those typically used in REHL based distros. So what is conclusion about this? But second update also had to give you, so let's listen about this conclusion. If you are already a Windows 11 subsystem for Linux WSL user, Windows 11 offers an enormously improved experience compared to what you are accustomed to from Windows 11. It installs more easily, makes more functionality available, and offers better desktop integration than older workarounds such as running Movax Strum X11 server. As a die-hard desktop Linux user myself, the new WSLG functionality is now where near enough to make me consider going back to Windows on the desktop, but it does not eliminate a lot of pain points for fellow Linux user trapped in Windows land at work, as well as offering the easiest way possible for newbies to get their feet wet and try new things. We especially appreciate Microsoft forward thinking approach in standardizing on Western VLAN rather than the X server, and the company apparent determination to really integrate it properly with the open source stack traditional desktop Linuxes are based on. If you are still on the fence about whether or when to bother with the Windows 11 upgrade, its new and improved WSL just might be the best reason yet to go ahead and take plug now. Yeah, so I had already told you that I am going to tell about the Windows 11 bug. So let's start about second update. Windows 11 bug could reduce Ryzen CPU performance by up to 15%. It's AMD says. Okay. So most people should not rush out to install brand new operating system version on day 1, and Windows 11 is no exception to that rule. AMD has published information about a pair of bugs that can reduce performance for Ryzen processors running Windows 11 by as much as 15%. So how much slowdown you observe will vary based on what you are doing and the CPU you are using. AMD expects both bugs to be fixed later this month. The first issue AMD has identified increases L3 cache latency by up to 3 times, affecting apps that rely on fast memory performance. AMD says that most affected apps will slow down by between 3 and 5%, but that some games commonly used for esports could see dips of between 10 and 15%. AMD says that a Windows update will fix this issue later this month. So as long as you are checking for installing Windows updates regularly, you won't need to do anything special to resolve this problem. The second bug is related to an AMD processor feature that tries to use your fastest individual CPU cores when running lightly threaded tasks rather than treating all cores the same. AMD does not put a number on this one but says the problem may be more detectable in processors with 8 or more cores and a 65 watt and higher TDP. This would include most 2000, 3000, 4000 and 5000 series Ryzen 7 and Ryzen 9 desktop CPUs and APUs. AMD says that software update, not a Windows update, will be released to fix problem later in October, so you may need to install new AMD chipset drivers or some other software to get the fix. The AMD Ryzen issues are separate from performance slowdowns caused by some of Windows virtualization based security features. In particular, testing by outlets like Tom's Hardware has shown that the memory integrity security feature can reduce performance by a few percentage points in some games and general computing tasks, though the results vary widely based on the software you are using and the processor you have. The feature is included in both Windows 10 and Windows 11 but is disabled by default in both operating systems for all but the most recent laptops and desktops sold by major PC makers. So this was the main update which I had to give you. Thanks for coming here, thanks for listening, thanks for supporting me, thanks for subscribing this channel. Okay, so come for next updates. Thanks.